You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast. We're going to get back to some opinion scholarship today. I'm very happy to be doing that, covering a topic I didn't expect to cover, but turns out I should have been on my radar. The topic today is the Sibyls of Ancient Greece, the prophetesses of Ancient Greece. So one of the things that I talk about quite a lot is the difference between organized religion and mystical experience. The idea that you can have a personal experience, a spiritual experience, or an experience of God or the divine, or however you want to frame it, or you can learn about it from other people. Which is, in a sense, is what church is about, is what organized religion is about. It's about going to be around other people, maybe who have had a mystical experience or a spiritual experience of their own, and you can benefit from their wisdom, or you're going there to perform rituals and rites. Religious rituals and rites are, in my opinion, reenactments of mystical experience. In some cases, they're reenactments of mythological stories, of course, but in many instances, they're intended to be or to recreate an altered state of consciousness of some kind. And this is why with rituals and rites, you have symbolic imagery, you have the manipulation of consciousness, whether it be through the lights, the surroundings. You're in a cathedral and it's a sort of awe-inspiring thing, or you're in the forest at night by campfire. Oftentimes there are periods of time involved where you're not eating, you're fasting, or you're not sleeping, let's say, or both, some combination. There's also ecstatic ritual, meaning singing, dancing, jumping, leaping. Maybe those rituals involve enduring some physical pain. There's a tribe, I don't know if it's in Africa or in South America, I can't remember, but they put those bullet ants inside of a glove. The reason they call those ants bullet ants is because when they bite you, it feels like you've been shot. It's one of the most painful bites. Maybe it's the most painful insect bite. I'm not entirely sure, but it's absolutely horrible. And they fill a glove full of these things. And the kids, the male kids, as a rite of passage, stick their hand in there, and then they're not allowed to show any pain. But even the bites and the venom and the pain, even that can be a dissociative experience, right? You're in so much pain that you find a way mentally to detach from your body. And so you even have there an altered state of consciousness arrived at through this experience of intense pain. But again, using fasting and sleep deprivation are also ways of doing it. Ecstatic ritual, like, a frenzied extended period of singing and dancing to the point of exhaustion, will also get you to this point of an altered state of consciousness. Now, that's not the type of experience that we have in church, generally speaking. Maybe you're one of those fringy Christian groups in the South that dances with poisonous snakes or something like that. Maybe it's different for you, but for most people, it's a little bit tame. Even the reenactments. When we look at even the Christian communion, we understand it's a reenactment. We understand that. The question is there a difference between the experience that the apostles had taking the communion in the presence of Jesus? Or is there a difference between the experience that Jesus had living the embodiment of those symbols, resurrecting from the grave? So clearly there's a difference between that and myself sitting in a pew eating a cracker and sipping on some grape juice. You know what I mean? So I really think it's important that there's a distinction between personal religious experience and communal experience. And organized religion is all based around communal experiences. I think that the communal experiences have become they've lost their potency. I guess that's what I want to say. I don't think many people sit through church or communal religious experience, rituals, rites, celebrations, and feel any kind of altered state of consciousness or feel any kind of communion with God. What I think is interesting, though, is that it hasn't always been that way. There are ancient religious practices and groups that are often called the mysteries, the mystery schools, the mystery cults. We hear about them with Eleusis in Greece. We hear about similar things with the oracle at the Temple of Delphi, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. We hear about the Samothracian mysteries, the mysteries of Isis, the mysteries of Mithra, and on and on and on. These secret religious ceremonies. And they're secret, so we can't learn everything we'd like to learn about them. But what we do understand from what little we have is that those mystery religions were something like a middle place between a shamanistic, personal, intimate experience of God and this communal experience that I would just call organized religion without trying to classify it, break it down any further. And these mystery cults seem to fall right in the middle. What do I mean by that? What I mean is the mystery cults seem to be a communal experience that is replicating a mystical experience, just like a rite or ritual would in any religious context. But the goal of the mystery religion is to actually cause the initiate to have that experience themselves. This is why the mystery religions almost, maybe exclusively, maybe there's some exceptions, but it seems like it's certainly with Eleusis. They were drinking the Kykeon brew. In the Mithraic mysteries and the Dionysian mysteries, there were psychoactive substances being used to create these altered states of consciousness. So the mystery schools seem to be, again, some sort of a middle place where it's a communal religious experience, but the goal is that the individual initiate in this group setting is brought to a personal mystical experience in the way that the prehistoric ancient shaman were able to do within themselves. So, and then Orphism also falls into that category. I shouldn't forget Orphism, very ancient mystery religion connected to the ancient Greeks, and on it goes. So in the mix of all of this stuff, all of the mystery faiths, mystical experience and shamanism, this connection that we see between all of these things, in the mix of this are these prophetesses, these women called the Sibyls. In ancient Greece, they had sacred temples that were dedicated to prophecy, and the virgin priestess who attended this temple would be the one you could go to and ask questions about the future, about the outcome of a battle, about should I marry this person, whatever it might be, and the Sibyl would be able to prophesy. There's all kinds of interesting things and descriptions in some of the ancient Greek and Roman writings that you could read, and we'll talk about some of them. But it clearly puts the Sibyls in this same realm. There are, in ancient Greece and elsewhere, priestesses that were virgins that attended temples. They called them Vestal virgins, if you've heard that word before. This was an uncommon thing to have these female virgin priestesses. Something about the purity of the virgin, the maiden, allowed her to, she was somehow the choice candidate for this sort of an experience. And depending on how much knowledge you have of the ancient world, the word Sibyl might sound to you like a goddess named Cybele. I'm not exactly sure how. I've heard her name pronounced differently, but Cybele and Sibyl sound an awful lot like one another. And so my mind was immediately drawn to the idea or the question, is there a relationship between Sibyl and Cybele? It turns out there really isn't. I mean, our archaeologists and linguists aren't suggesting that. But I thought it was kind of interesting. And one of the reasons why I thought it was interesting is because Cybele was a pre-Hellenic goddess. That means before the time of the Hellenic Greeks, the Mycenaeans, the folks that we associate with classical Greek culture. And Cybele was worshipped before that group even came into the scene. She was worshipped by the folks that were there before, the folks that would become the Hellenes, and elsewhere in Turkey and surrounding areas. Cybele was a mother goddess. She was the great mother goddess. And this is one of the most ancient symbols of a divinity that we know of. It goes back, this mother goddess image, we can trace it all the way back to the Paleolithic. If you guys ever look up these Venus figurines, is what they call them. Venus, the Venus of Willendorf, the Venus of oh boy, what's the big? In any case, they're usually very fat women statues, usually without much of a head. It's everything that's emphasized is the breasts and the hips and all of the things surrounding fertility. And they go back a long, long way. They go back, 30, 40, 50,000 years. We have evidence of these great mother goddess images. And Cybele is sort of like the pre-classical, or one of the pre-classical versions of this great mother goddess. And what's interesting about that is the Sibyls were associated with worship of the great mother goddess. So if you go back to the earliest records of the earliest Sibyl, this was before the time of the classical Greeks, and they weren't worshiping the classical Greek pantheon. They were worshiping this tradition all the way from the Paleolithic of this great mother goddess. She's half of the Ouroboros, right? The great mother is something that will become like Mother Earth, Gaia. And her counterpart is Father Heaven, Uranus. That's the other part of the Ouroboros image, that ancient religious image. You have the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine. Together, they're the Ouroboros. And so this is half of it. And it's an important half of it because the great mother goddess represents fertility and life. And, what could be more important? And this is the explanation for why the mother goddess was so prominent in ancient times, and how she continued to survive all the way up through the classical pantheon and still have a place, even as the world becomes more patriarchal, even as the gods become more defined and there's more of them and they're interacting with other cultures and on and on and on. And yet she still has a place as Cybele, as Gaia, as Rhea, as all these Demeter, right? All these goddesses. So the Sibyls originally were associated with the worship of the great mother goddess. Now, interesting, Cybele, as a goddess, she's associated with some interesting things. She's associated with music, wine, and ecstatic rituals. All of these things should be ringing bells. They sound like the same components of these mystery religions. Music and ecstatic rituals, that's the dancing, the extended periods of dancing, becoming exhausted and entering an altered state of consciousness. Wine is associated with Dionysus and intoxication, and that we call wine spirits because that's what it was thought to be, a spirit that you're imbued by. This Dionysian spirit was also an altered state of consciousness. You can see that how common this theme is here. Now, the Sibyls are associated mostly with the Temple of Apollo, not with the Great Mother Goddess. This was a very ancient version that gets supplanted by the Temple of Apollo. And the Sibyls continue, but they're, rather than being associated with the Great Mother, now they're associated with Apollo. He subsumes this Mother Goddess as the center of the oracular cults. It turns out Apollo has a lot of the same connotations, a lot of the same things associated with altered states of consciousness. So you can see why Apollo was able to subsume the Mother Goddess, but I'll save some of that for a bit. So the next thing I want to talk about is while we're talking about these Sibyls, there's two different collections of these prophecies that the Sibyls made. Two different versions that you'll see popping up, and there's a lot of confusion between the two, and I found it difficult trying to prepare for this, so let me just explain. There are the Book of the Sibyls, and then there are the Sibylline Oracles. For those people who are familiar with this at all, you've probably heard of the Sibylline Oracles. Maybe you haven't heard of the Book of the Sibyls. Now, the Book of the Sibyls is the more ancient of the two. It's actually more or less lost. We don't have much. We have very little to provide evidence for the Book of the Sibyls. But we do hear them spoken of by many ancient people. We know that they existed. We know that they were actually in the hands of the Romans and were used as a way of appealing to the prophecies of these ancient Sibyls to help guide the path of the Roman Empire, right? Something like that. So the Book of the Sibyls was a collection in ancient times of the prophecies of the Sibyls. There are more than one Sibyl. We're going to talk all about that today, but there was a collection of these prophecies that were put together, and it was considered to be a sacred text. And it passed from hand to hand. It was protected really well, really carefully. These were very valuable. These were the words of the gods, the divine messages, that human beings could benefit from. The Book of the Sibyls. The Sibylline Oracles, on the other hand, are much later. They sort of profess to be the Book of the Sibyls, but they aren't. The Sibylline Oracles are essentially a Christian collection of prophecies. They're very interesting. They're kind of Nostradamus-like. Very, very compelling to read. There's all sort of interesting blend of Christian and pagan and Jewish words and ideas in the Sibylline Oracles that make them very, very interesting. Problem is, they aren't the Book of the Sibyls. They were created much later. There's a lot of fuckery involved with the Sibylline Oracles where they're, again, purporting to be this older thing, and they're not. It's not even clear to me that the Sibylline Oracles came from the Sibyls at all. But when we read about the Book of the Sibyls, we find some interesting things, that they're associated with prophecies that predicted the Trojan War, prophecies that predicted the coming of Alexander the Great, and prophecies that seem to indicate the coming of Jesus Christ. Now, the early Christians saw the Sibyls because of these prophecies associated with Jesus. The early Christians saw the Sibyls as proof that God sent the same prophecies to the Gentiles as he did to the chosen ones, to the Jewish people. So this is sort of maybe a political angle, maybe an intentional one, but the Christians saw the Sibyls predicting the coming of Jesus as a way of making the Gentiles equal to the Jews in the eyes of the early church. It's like chosen schmosen. We got the prophecies too, something like that. And this is the reason why the Sibylline Oracles were created, because the early Christians latched onto these prophecies and expounded on them. The Sibyls themselves, they're mentioned dozens and dozens of times in the writings of the early church fathers, 2nd century, 3rd century AD, dozens of times. All right, so what is a Sibyl? Let me just get into some of the background, and then we'll actually talk through this. So the word Sibyl, actually, again, I assumed that it had some connection with Cybele. It doesn't seem to. It has a Greek root. It's Sibylla, and there's a lot of controversy over what that means. Some people believe that it means divine counsel. It's associated with a word that means divine counsel, like speaking, communicating to the gods. Euripides, in the 400s BC, he attested that the Sibyl is half mortal and half divine. So this is what we're dealing with here. Virgin priestess, half mortal, half divine, who's like this intermediary. Of course, she's half mortal and half divine, right? She's the intermediary between the world of the mortals and the divine realm. And she's the person that can mediate between them, right? Of course, she's half mortal and half divine. She'd have to be. This is like the symbol of what a Sibyl is, what a Sibyl does. The Sibyls were, again, prophetesses in ancient Greece. They prophesied at these holy sites, these oracles. And initially, those holy sites were dedicated to that great mother goddess, and that was true all the way back to the Stone Age, to the Paleolithic. But they later become associated almost exclusively. There's one exception with the Temple of Zeus, but almost exclusively with the Temple of Apollo. And remember the connection that I was trying to make between Apollo and Cybele earlier. Apollo was the god of music and dance, the god of prophecy and healing. So there's a lot of overlap here, right, between Cybele and Apollo. Music and dance, that's all a part of the Cybele sort of associations. And again, music and dance relates to that ecstatic ritual and altered state of consciousness. Prophecy is part and parcel to that, going into the realm of the divine and having access to information there that you don't have access to in the mortal world. That's prophecy, baby. And then healing. And I think that's interesting. The fact that Apollo, the god associated with these altered states, is also associated with healing, that has connections to modern psychology, which I think is interesting. The power of the mind and consciousness to heal the body, or even to heal psychological illnesses, neuroses, you might call them, but also the shaman. Remember the ancient shaman, who's the forerunner of these oracles. The shaman was the medicine man. He went into the spirit world very often to find healing for someone who's sick. And Apollo has all of this. So all of these are associated with prehistoric shamanism and also altered states of consciousness. Again, I think that is the root. These altered states are the root of individual experiences of the divine, and as such, the basis of all organized religion, of all of the stories that we tell about gods and spirits in the spirit realm. All right, let's talk about the Sibyl at Delphi for a second. We're going to talk about all of them in a little bit more detail, but the Sibyl at Delphi has been dated to as early as 1100 BC by a Greek geographer named Pausanias. I saw other references that suggested that the oracles maybe even go back 1,000 years before that. But writing in the 2nd century, Pausanias says, yes, that we know about the oracle at Delphi all the way back to 1100 BC, and maybe even deeper than that. And in the beginning, in the early days, there appears to have only been one Sibyl. There weren't many in the beginning. There was only one. Now, both Heraclitus, writing in around 500 BC, and Plato, about 100 years later, they speak of only one Sibyl. Probably this is the Sibyl at Delphi. But over the 100 years following the time of Plato, there were at least 3 more Sibyls. The Phrygian Sibyl, kind of in Western Turkey, the Erythraean Sibyl, kind of on the Aegean coast of Turkey, and the Hellespontine, which may have been somewhere like in Macedonia. By the 1st century BC, Roman sources attest to 10 Sibyls. Right? The Persian, the Libyan, the Delphic, the Sumerian, the Erythraean, the Samian, the Cumaean, the Hellespontine, the Phrygian, and the Tiburtine. All of these Sibyls suddenly, by the time you reach the 1st century BC. So I don't know exactly what that means. It kind of looks to me like a little bit of a contagious thing. There definitely seems to have been one virgin prophetess oracle in ancient Greece, and that was either copied in other places, and who knows why that might be, or maybe this movement was somehow contagious. It was something that spread naturally. So what I want to do here is I want to read to you the earliest fragments, the earliest quotations that we have historically that talk about the Sibyls. Both of them come from Heraclitus. So again, this is 500s BC, sometime around then. We don't have a lot. We've talked about Heraclitus in the past. We don't have a lot of what these pre-Socratic philosophers left. But in the case of Heraclitus, we have fragments, we have bits and pieces that other people wrote down. Heraclitus said this, even though we don't have those documents anymore, we have records. And so in fragment 33 and fragment 92, we have some things worth hearing. So Herodotus tells us this. He tells us, quote, "The Lord, whose oracle is in Delphi, neither indicates clearly nor conceals, but gives a sign." Then in fragment 92, we have the Sibyl with frenzied mouth penetrates through the centuries by the power of the gods. Right, so in both of these cases, we have a reference to the oracle at Delphi called the Sibyl. She speaks with frenzied mouth and penetrates through the centuries, right? That means she can speak to the future. She can speak to the ancient past. She can do this through the power of the gods. And then we have this interesting bit about the Lord whose oracle is at Delphi, neither indicates clearly nor conceals, but gives a sign. And this tells us something about what the prophecies were like, right? The prophecies aren't so direct as to indicate something clearly. And they're not beating around the bush so much as to hide something from you. They're giving you a sign. They're giving you something to go on. But they're not laying it all out for you. You have to, there seems to be some level of interpretation involved with the prophecies. And I can't help but be reminded of the prophecies of Nostradamus, because they also require a certain amount of interpretation. And it's also what seems to make them so valid over a long stretch of time. If you're not so specific, then the prophecy can seem to apply in lots of areas, and it gives it these sort of a numinous feel. It's like this is something that seems true over and over and over again. Like the prophecies themselves get fulfilled and refulfilled. It's almost like the prophet knows something about the nature of reality and the nature of human beings, that they can say something so profound that it would be true in some case and continue to be true in the future. Some people feel that way when they read the Bible deeply. It's like you read a passage that you haven't read in years, and suddenly it has new meaning to you, right? It's like, strange, right? Something numinous about that. All right. So what I want to do now is I want to start talking through a couple of, facts that we have from these 10 Sibyls that we have historical record of, starting with the Delphic Sibyl, the Sibyl at Delphi. So probably the earliest documented Sibyl was the Oracle at Delphi. She was said to have been venerated from before the Trojan Wars, so from a time before the Trojan Wars. Even before Delphi was the temple of Apollo, right? Originally, Delphi was a place of worship for Gaia, for the mother goddess, and was connected to fertility rituals. By the 8th century BC, she became the priestess of Apollo that we know as the Pythia. So some people are familiar with that word, the Pythia. So she wasn't even the Pythia for the whole time, right? She became the Pythia in the 8th century. Before that, it wasn't even associated with Apollo at all. Similarly, we have the Sibyl of Dodona, possibly going back to the 2nd millennium BC, as older than the Delphic Sibyl. According to Herodotus, she was originally devoted, the oracle was originally devoted to the mother goddess, not to Apollo, but was eventually supplanted by Zeus. So this is one of those examples where the Sibyl of Dodona, the holy site there was not the temple of Apollo. In this case, it was actually the temple of Zeus. And the earliest written accounts in Homer, and this is in the Iliad, it goes back to 750 BC, describe Dodona as the oracle of Zeus. And here's what's so interesting about the Sibyl of Dodona. Thousands of oracular tablets have been uncovered there, written in different languages, different alphabets, dated to between the 6th and 2nd centuries BC. So there seems to be a collection here of these prophecies going back hundreds of years and significantly before the time of Christ. These things are associated with the Book of the Sibyls, not the Sibylline Oracles. This is the original shit we're talking about. And like these mystery religions we were talking about earlier, that there was the prophecies, these oracles were really secretive. They were kept under wraps. And it really becomes a political thing. It's like, if you had knowledge of the future, would you want that knowledge to get out to your enemies? No, you want to keep that advantage for yourself. So you keep that shit secret. And so we have something similar here, where the mysteries were kept secret, not a lot was written down, not a lot was kept. You know, that information was guarded and protected. The same thing was true with these prophecies of the Sibyls. And yet we did uncover thousands of these in Dodona. All right, that brings me to the Cimmerian Sibyl. She was the priestess that presided over the Temple of Apollo at Cimmerium. This is in Italy. Now, like the Oracle of Delphi, she's said to have been worshipped by the populations that lived there before the time of the Hellenes, before the Greeks came. So again, we're talking about quite possibly associated with a great mother goddess or something else like we talked about a little earlier. Like this is a tradition that goes way, way back. All right, this brings me to the Cumaean Sibyl. A little bit more here I want to talk about. Now, she presided over the Temple of Apollo at Cumaea, and this was a Greek colony near Naples, so we're also here talking about Italy. And there was a lot of Greek colonies there, of course, in the early days. Now, famously, she's said to have sold the Sibylline Book to the last king of Rome. She's also famously the Sibyl that Aeneas consults in Virgil's Aeneid. Now, Aeneas is one of these cultural figures that's kind of like Romulus and Remus, associated with the birth of Rome. These are, you know, historical, mythological figures. And so Aeneas plays a fundamental role in the Roman kind of culture and history. So she's quite famous, this Cumaean Sibyl, the person who sold all of these precious prophecies to the king of Rome. You know, maybe it may be a great sin, and we'll see why. But before I do this, I want to read to you, because she is supposed to have been consulted by Aeneas. We have the words of Virgil in the Aeneid talking about her. So I want to read this to you. All right, this is from book 6 of the Aeneid. It goes like this. The huge side of the Iobian rock is hewn into a cavern, into which lead 100 wide mouths, 100 gateways, from which rush as many voices, the answers of the Sibyl. They had come to the threshold when the maiden cries, "'Tis time to ask the oracle, the god, lo, the god." As thus she spoke before the doors. Suddenly not countenance nor color was the same, nor stayed her tresses braided, but her bosom heaves, her heart swells with wild frenzy, and she's taller to behold. Nor has her voice a mortal ring, since now she feels the nearer breath of deity. "Are you slow to vow and to pray?" she cries. "Are you slow, Trojan Aeneas? For till then the mighty mouths of the awestruck house will not gape open." So she spoke and was muted. All right, let me just stop there. There's more. So a couple things here. You see that these priestesses were typically found in these caves or caverns. That was the place where they resided. And you get this really beautiful description, as far as I'm concerned, where he's talking about into the carved rock, into the cavern. It leads to 100 wide mouths. So I'm seeing like all these different pathways into the cavern. And he calls them 100 gateways, from which rush as many voices, the answer of the Sibyl. So imagine you're asking a question to the Sibyl, and I'm just picturing this wind, this air rushing through these various pathways in the cavern, and the sound of the rushing wind through the cavern is actually speaking to the Sibyl. It's answering the question from the gods. And the Sibyl says to Aeneas, you know, it's time to ask the oracle. It's time to ask the god. What is it that you want? And then this strange thing happens here. It says, as she spoke before the doors, and this to me sounds like another religious phenomena. It sounds like transfiguration. Okay, this is something that we talk about in the Christian context as well. It's something like the physical transformation of something from something mundane to something sacred. This transfiguration. And listen to how it's described. It says, suddenly not countenance nor color was the same. She's talking about the way the Sibyl looks. Suddenly her face and her color is different than it was a second ago. It said, nor stayed her tresses braided. So her hair has come undone. But her bosom heaves, her heart swells with wild frenzy. So now she seems to be convulsing and moving around wildly. It says she's taller to behold. It's like she looks bigger. It says, nor has her voice a mortal ring, because you can just imagining like exorcism movies where her voice actually changes, right? And then she says, are you slow to vow and to pray? She's like, hurry up, ask your goddamn question, you know? And she says, until you ask your question, the mighty mouths of the awestruck house will not gape open. That's the voice of the gods that comes through the cavern. Like that answer is not going to come until you ask the question. And then she just shuts up and waits. And it picks up like this. Aeneas says, you most holy prophetess who foreknow the future, grant that the Trojans may rest in Latinum. Then to Apollo will I set up a temple of solid marble. You also a stately shrine awaits in our realm. For here I will place your oracles and mystic utterances told to my people. So you see, Aeneas is sort of giving her a promise. He recognizes her as being able to know the future. He says that he wants he and his men to be able to be safe to find this land, Latium. And this is basically Rome. This is part of the story of Aeneas and his men leaving the Trojan War, going to resettle in the kind of like the promised land. And this is Rome. And he says, I will build a temple to Apollo. Like this is the gratitude that I'm going to express to the gods. If you do this for me. He says, like, I'm also going to build a shrine to you, to the Sibyl, and that's where I'll keep your oracle. That's where I'll keep them. And this is connected to this idea of the book of the Sibyls, where these oracles were maintained. They were written and they were maintained like holy writ, sacred, right? So they were kept in the temple. She says, all right, it continues like this. The prophetess storms wildly in the cavern, so she may shake the mighty God from her breast. Man, oh man. So she's continuing to sort of frenzy, to move around and to shout and to like she's working herself up into a frenzy. And it says that. It says she storms wildly so that she may shake the mighty God from her breast. She's waking him up, right? And you can see how this is her approaching this altered states of consciousness. This is exactly like the ecstatic ritual we talked about a little earlier. It goes on, it says, so much the more he tires her raving mouth, tames her wild heart, and molds her by constraint. And now the 100 mighty mouths of the house have opened of their own will, and bring through the air the seer's reply. So what's happened here, right? She's wildly, moving around, screaming, whatever it is she's doing. And it says that he tires her raving mouth. So this is the God that she's woken within her. He tires her mouth, so she stops screaming and chanting or whatever she's doing, tames her heart, so she finally stops moving, and molds her by constraint. Now she's fully possessed by the spirit of the God. She's not leaping around doing anything crazy. Now she's sort of found calm, and she's very strange. You can imagine seeing somebody behaving that way, then suddenly becoming calm all of a sudden and talking with another voice. It's very much like a horror movie. And it says, and now the 100 mighty mouths of the house have opened of their own will. So these are those tunnels in the cavern. Now the voice of the gods have opened. And here's the seer's reply. Quote, O you that have survived the great perils of the sea, by land more grievous woes lie in wait. Into the realm of Lavinium the sons of Dardanus shall come. Wars, grim wars, I see, and the Tiber foaming with streams of blood. Even now in Latium, a new Achilles has been born, himself a goddess's son. The cause of all this Trojan woe is again an alien bride, again a foreign marriage. Yield not to ills, but go forth, all the bolder to face them as far as your destiny will allow. The road to safety, little though you think it, shall first issue from a Grecian city. So this is her prophecy. You can see how there's some interpretation, right? Who is the new Achilles that's been born? And you know, who are the sons of Dardanus, and what is this war? And you know, it's referring to another alien bride, another foreign marriage. That's what caused the Trojan War, of course. So what is who's foreign bride? Who's foreign marriage? What are we talking about? You can see how you might be able to interpret that over and over and over again to be relevant at different points in time. This is the sort of thing that I want to show you. Now, I want to show you something else because I just sort of read this description of what it was like for somebody to go to the oracle and witness this spectacle of her prophesying. We also have something in pop culture that comes to mind that I just wanted to show you. In the movie 300, that talks about the Greek Battle of Thermopylae, same sort of time period we're talking about here. There's a point where the oracle is, where Leonidas goes to the oracle asking for assistance, asking to know the future, the outcome of the battle, and it's sort of a beautiful scene. So let me just show this to you. Here we go.
Senseless tradition. Tradition even Leonidas cannot defy. For he must respect the word of the ephors. That is the law.
Those people just listening. Oracles laying down.
And no spot,
fire,
subject or citizen, man or woman, slave or king,
scraping the floor
is above
with the nails.
Yes,
It's almost like she's breaking this. Meanwhile, the smoke herself. The king is just watching, waiting. Exhausted. She's lying there. Okay. Stop sharing there. Okay. So, and then at that moment where she's exhausted, that's when she actually opens her mouth and prophesies. So I just wanted you to see that pop culture reference there. I thought that was quite the beautiful scene. It made quite the impression on me when I first saw it. All right. So that's Virgil for you. Okay. So this brings us to another text that I want to talk about, Virgil's fourth eclogue. Now, in Virgil's fourth eclogue, the Cumaean Sibyl foretells the coming of a savior. This is one of these early points where Christians will say that the Sibyls were foretelling the coming of Jesus. And I want to talk about this because this is the reason why we're still talking about the Sibyls today. This is the reason why the Sibylline Oracles were written, why they became so popular, why the early Christian fathers spoke so much about the Sibyls, why, in fact, the early Christians were, in some cases, they were called Sibyllists. The early Christians were called Sibyllists. It's no surprise, it's no mystery that early Christianity was considered a mystery religion. In the same way that the Dionysian mysteries or the mysteries of Isis or Mithra or Orpheus or whoever, in that same vein, Christianity was considered a mystery religion. And again, the early Christians were called Sibyllists. Unbelievable. So in Virgil's fourth eclogue, there's this prophecy about a savior. Now, many historians believe that the prophecy was supposed to reference Caesar Augustus, but the Christians have also attached onto this to say, no, this sounds like a prophecy of Jesus. So let me just read this to you. Virgil says, Now the last age by Cumae's Sibyl sung has come and gone. and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. Justice returns with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. Only do thou at the boy's birth, in whom the iron shall cease, the golden race arise. Befriend him, chaste Lucina, 'tis thine own Apollo. And in thy consulate this glorious age shall begin. Under thy guidance, what remain of our old wickedness, once done away, shall free the earth from never ceasing fear. He shall receive the life of the gods, and see heroes with gods commingling, and himself be seen by them, and with his father's worth reign over a world at peace. Dear child of gods, great progeny of Zeus, see how the earth and wide ocean and vault profound all see enraptured of the coming time. Whew, buddy. So maybe not as clear as you might like, but beautiful nonetheless. And let me hone in on a couple of things here. All right, when he says that at the boy's birth, in whom the golden race arise, it's possible that he's taught, the Christian interpretation is that the golden race here is something like, I don't know, the saved. There's this idea of the ancient Greek idea about human beings having been created first of gold, and then of silver, and then of bronze, and then of clay. And so human beings were created over and over and over again for various reasons. That the more perfect they weren't really able to live. They had to be replaced and redesigned. And so to bring back the golden race is a reference to this time of perfection, this Edenic paradise. So at the boy's birth, in whom the golden race arise. And it says, befriend him, chaste Lucina. So chaste Lucina. Lucina is a goddess, the goddess of light, right? Lucina, Lucis, that's the Latin for light, and of birth, of childbirth. So befriend him, chaste Lucina is like a virgin goddess of light and birth. So there's a connection between maybe the Virgin Mary there, we're talking about the boy's birth. But then it says, 'tis thine own Apollo. What the prophet is saying is this boy who's born is your Apollo. What does that mean? Well, it may mean that this boy is a god. If the boy is Apollo, then the boy is a god. But Apollo is what? Apollo is the son of Zeus. Jesus was the son of God. Apollo is the god of prophecy, so he's a prophet, right? So when this prophecy says this boy is going to be born and he is your Apollo, that might mean he is the son of God and a prophet, right? That's what Jesus was. Isn't that interesting? And then it says, of our old wickedness once done away shall free the earth from never ceasing fear. All of our old wickedness will be done away, right? This is like the original sin being finally conquered by the sacrifice of Jesus. Our old wickedness will finally be done away. Now it says some interesting things here too. It says, he shall receive the life of gods. He shall receive the life of gods and see heroes with gods commingling. Okay, so a couple things here. A human, a mortal, a baby being born who has the life of gods is some sort of a reference to a god-man, right? It's sort of certainly a demigod in the Greek sense. And that's what they're talking about when he says heroes with gods commingling, right? That's what the demigods were. Like Hercules was part man, part god. So this idea of the heroes and gods commingling is another reference, as far as I'm concerned, to the god-man, God and men together in one form. It says, and himself be seen of them, and with his father's worth reign over a world at peace. And of course, that is the ultimate prophecy of Jesus, that after Armageddon, Jesus will rule the new Jerusalem and the world finally at peace. And then it just right straight to the point says, dear child of gods, great progeny of Zeus. Right? It's saying, this is the son of the high God. This baby that's to be born is the son of the high God. And then it says, how the earth and wide ocean and vault profound, that's the vault of heaven. So how earth and heaven and ocean will see enraptured of the coming time. It's like the cosmos. This reminds me kind of like the Magi coming to visit the baby Jesus being born. But in this case, it's not three wise men that are bowing down at this great, creation. It's the earth and the oceans and the heaven bowing down, right? They're enraptured, waiting for the coming of this great thing. So you can see how these early Christians might have latched on to this sort of thing. Okay, that brings me to the Erythaian Sibyl. Of course, the Erythaian Sibyl presided over the temple of Apollo at Erythea. This is a town in Ionia, so again, modern Turkey. She was attested to going all the way back to the 8th century BC, so very ancient. And she was supposedly one of the Sibyls that predicted the Trojan War and prophesied that Troy would be destroyed. Now, she's also believed to have prophesied about the coming of Christ. And a prophecy survives, but it's not from deep antiquity. In this case, this is one of those pieces of confusion between the Sibylline Book and the Sibylline Oracles. In this case, we think that this prophecy is much more recent in time, so probably not from the Sibylline Book, but it's interesting because it's very, very the prophecy itself seems to describe like a fiery demise for humanity. And it's intense and it's interesting to read. It's not super obvious what it's warning us about, but it actually has this acrostic built in. So if you take the first letter of every line, it actually spells out Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior, Cross. Again, interesting, but maybe neither here nor there, because this to me is not associated with the early Sibyls. It's associated with those that were already Christian, and as cool as they may be, I have a little bit of hesitation because ultimately what I'm trying to talk about is legitimate prophecy, legitimate spiritual experience. With the Sibylline Oracles already being Christian, it seems to me like there's plenty of reason why early Christians would pretend that there were prophecies of Christ that predate the time of Christ. That's not particularly interesting to me. In fact, that it's very obviously a lie, and it sort of seems intentionally misleading. So this is why I didn't spend any time on the Sibylline Oracles and really wanted to hone in on the Book of the Sibyls. Okay, so there was a Persian Sibyl. Now, where the Persian Sibyl presided, the Temple of Apollo somewhere, we don't exactly know in this case, because the Persian Sibyl was also called the Babylonian Sibyl, the Chaldean Sibyl, and the Hebrew Sibyl. So we don't really know where this temple was, but the Persian Sibyl is famous for having foretold the coming of Alexander the Great and all of the accomplishments that he would have. That brings me to the Libyan Sibyl. The Libyan Sibyl is exactly what it sounds like. Libyan pertains to Africa, so this was the African Sibyl, presided over at the temple of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa Oasis. This is in the western desert of Egypt. And if you don't know Zeus Ammon, this is one of these interesting things I always loved learning about, where cultures that were different enough that they had different pantheons and different languages and different cultures would come together and recognize, hey, this God that we have is the same as that God that you have. And both sides agree. It's amazing. It's amazing. Both sides agree. Oh, this God Ammon that the Egyptians have been worshiping is exactly this God Zeus that the Greeks are worshiping. And this is what happened in ancient times when the Hellenic people, interacted with the ancient Egyptians. They came to this conclusion, Zeus and Ammon, and they worshipped Zeus Ammon as one God. And you basically have this Hellenic statue of Zeus that looks just like a Greek statue of Zeus, but it's got these gnarly horns, All right, so according to Plutarch, this oracle was actually consulted by Alexander after his conquest of Egypt. And she was the one that confirmed that Alexander is a god and also the divine or the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt. So she was the one that legitimized Alexander's taking over as pharaoh of Egypt. That brings me to the Hellespontine Sibyl. The Oracle of Apollo there was at Dardania, is what it's called. And now the Sibylline book was actually attributed to the Hellespontine Sibyl. Like maybe she was the one that preserved this book over time. She actually had this book kept at the Temple of Apollo at Gergis. And she was famous, particularly in the later Roman period, for a claim that she predicted the crucifixion of Jesus. But again, this story comes very likely from those Sibylline Oracles, not from the earlier Sibylline book. Then we have the Phrygian Sibyl, but there's a lot of confusion around the Phrygian Sibyl. In fact, it seems like in some cases she's just, when they use the word Phrygian Sibyl, they just mean the Hellespontine Sibyl or the Erythraean Sibyl. So there's actually, it's not clear whether there was a Phrygian Sibyl separate from the Hellespontine and Erythraean Sibyl. Then there's the Samian Sibyl, and the temple there was on the Isle of Samos. She was supposed to have prophesied the birth of Jesus in a stable. That's an interesting detail to get right. And lastly, there's the Tiburtine Sibyl. This is sometimes called the Etruscan Sibyl, so also an Italian Sibyl from the Roman town of Tibur. Now, according to legend, Emperor Augustus, this would have been in the 1st century BC, consulted with her after the Senate ordered that he be worshipped as a god. So Caesar Augustus, before he was, I guess, Caesar, he comes to her and he says, "Hey, I'm being asked by the Senate to take this divine status to be worshipped as a god, and he wants to know if that's right. Should he do that?" And her response to him was to show him a vision of a young woman with a baby boy, while a voice, like a disembodied voice from the sky, says, "This is the virgin who shall conceive the Savior of the world." Okay, so this is 100 years before the time of Christ. And this is the prophecy attributed to her. This is the virgin who shall conceive the Savior of the world. Now, you can see that there may be some wiggle room there. There's other people we could point to as virgin born, certainly in the world of ancient mythology. So does this indicate Jesus? Well, considering the timing, it's interesting, isn't it? So let me talk a little bit about the Sibylline books. These are a collection of oracles, and they were supposedly purchased by the last king of Rome, and they were consulted at moments of crisis, right? You know, they got some big decision to make, some big problem they're facing, some big army at the gates. They consult the book of the Sibyls to see what they should do. And only fragments of the book have survived. The Sibylline books are not the same as the Sibylline Oracles. The Sibylline Oracles are 12 books of prophecy that have Judeo-Christian origins. They're much, much later. Now, according to Roman tradition, the oldest collection of Sibylline books appears to have been made around the time of Solon. So this is 600 to 500 BC, somewhere in there. And it was attributed to the Hellespontine Sibyl. Was preserved at the Temple of Apollo at Gergis. And then from Gergis, it passed to Erythraea, and it became famous at Erythraea. Everybody came to know about the book then. And it found its way to Cumaea and finally to Rome, where it was preserved, and it was actually guarded in a vault beneath the Capitoline Temple of Jupiter. This is the main temple of the high god in Rome. That's where it was kept. And it was, 24/7 guarded by 12 people. But the temple burned down in 83 BC, and they were lost. The 12 guards couldn't protect it from the flames, it seems. And so the Sibylline books disappear around 83 BC. So I was able to learn that there are some genuine Sibylline verses that are preserved in a book called the Book of Marvels. This is a 2nd century AD book by a guy named Phlegon of Tralles. And then again, there was thousands of fragments that were discovered at Dodona. So you have some pieces of this that we still have. And that brings me to the prophecies of Christ. So really, what I want to do here is talk about what these prophecies were. I want to tell you that I took these prophecies from a book called As David and the Sibyls Say, which is basically a historical summary of all the Sibylline sayings and oracles that this priest, I think he was a priest, Alfred Cannon White, put together over basically a life of research. And when he died, he gave that information to Mariana Monteiro. We spoke about her when we were reading myths from the Basque area of Spain. So we know her a little bit already. This would have been published around 1905. So this guy basically dies with his book, his life's work, unfinished and unpublished, and Mariana finishes it. She presents these prophecies in Latin. So I sort of had to just get translations where I could. So take this with a grain of salt. But these are the prophecies of Christ. So let's start with the Persian Sibyl. Prophecy goes like this. Then a certain voice will come through the desert places, wretched mortal tidings that cry out to all, that they may make their paths and cleanse themselves from vices and clean their bodies with water. So this is meant to be a prophecy of John the Baptist. And if you are familiar with the biblical tales, you kind of pick up on that pretty quickly. A voice comes from the wilderness. That's the phrase from the Bible. In this case, it says a certain voice will come through the desert. Wretched mortal tidings that cry out, that they may make their paths and cleanse themselves from vices and clean their bodies with water. So here you have a reference to potentially a baptism. John is the voice from the desert who comes out and cleans people of their sins, their vices, using water. Isn't that interesting? The Persian Sibyl also says, the child of God will be born of a virgin mother and will be the cause of the salvation of a fallen nation. Whew, buddy. And she says, behold, the beast shall be trampled, and the Lord shall be born in the world. And the womb of the virgin shall be the salvation of the nations, and the invisible word shall be felt. Oh, man. Hair on my arm stands up. So the beast shall be trampled comes directly, right? You remember that directly from the book of Revelations. The Lord shall be born in the world, right? God shall be born into the world. And the womb of the virgin will be the salvation of nations. There you have Mary. And the invisible word shall be felt, right? What is the invisible word? That's the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God, right? The invisible word shall be felt, to put your hands on it, to be actually felt. The Logos will be made flesh and will be felt. Isn't that interesting? Now we can go to the Libyan Sibyl in Egypt. She said, behold, the day will come, and the Lord will lighten the clouds of darkness, and the bonds of the assembly will be loosed, and they will see the King of the living, and the Virgin Lady of the nations will hold him in her bosom, and he will reign in mercy. From his mother's womb will be the balance of all things. From the womb of the Virgin will be the balance of all things. All right, the Cumana Sibyl, she goes like this. The fate of death will end with 3 days of sleep. Then he will come out of the dead and come to the joyful light, showing the first beginning of the resurrection. Unbelievable. The fate of death will end with 3 days of sleep, and he will come out of the dead into the joyful light, right? Jesus was supposed to be crucified and dead in the tomb for 3 days. He goes into the underworld, and then he's resurrected. And it says the fate of death will end with 3 days of sleep. Then he will come out of the dead and come to the joyful light. All right, let's keep going. The Phrygian Sibyl was attributed, but with this prophecy, I saw God himself wanting to punish the highest. And because our crimes would fill our skin, he wanted to release the body of the virgin into heaven. God himself is the offspring, which the angel of the soul announces, who would wash the wretched. All right, so God wants to punish the highest. God sees corruption in the hands of people who are meant to be leaders and meant to be noble. Maybe those are the Pharisees or something. And he says, and because our crimes would fill our skin, and because human beings are so full of vice and sin that we're corrupt, up to our eyeballs, we're incapable of saving ourselves. Because of that, he wants to release the virgin. And God himself is the offspring, which the angel of the soul announces. Who would wash the wretched? Right? So you release the virgin so that God can be born and wash the wretched of what? Of their sins, of their crimes. I can't help but think of John 3:16 there. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. And that, of course, involves baptism by water and by the Holy Spirit. All right, the Egyptian Sibyl is attributed with this. The invisible word will be touched. The mother's womb will surround it, and God will bloom with everlasting joy. It will be born from its mother as God. Man. Here again, we have another reference to the invisible word, to the Logos. The invisible word will be touched. It'll be flesh. It'll be touched. The mother's womb will surround it, and God will bloom from that. It will be born from its mother as God. So here you have the virgin giving birth to God. And then lastly, the Erythæan Sibyl, who said, in the last age, God will be humbled, and the divine offspring will be humanized. Divinity will be joined to humanity. Man, isn't that beautiful? In the last age, God will be humbled. Isn't that an interesting way to say that the divine is embodied, right? God is embodied as a man, and that's a way of, he goes from this infinite, omnipotent, all-powerful state to this limited, mortal, frail body, like every one of us. God will be humbled, and the divine will be humanized. It will be joined to humanity. God and man joined. Whew. That brings me to my conclusion. Okay, first let's consider the Sibyls as something like shaman. They have the unique and rare ability to commune with the divine. They foretell the future, divine how to heal illness, and provide guidance as to the affairs of men and nations. All of this they receive from the realm of the gods, from the divine messenger of the gods, Apollo. The Sibyls are the embodiment of Apollo on earth. They are literally possessed by him, and in that possession become a living connection between the gods and men. This is, of course, exactly the role of the shaman from prehistory. Shaman are the living link between the spirit world and the mortal one. They exist in both realms and bring back from the spirit world gifts of healing, prophecy, and unlearned wisdom. And like the shaman, the Sibyl has learned the techniques that make communion possible. Both achieve the requisite altered states of consciousness through ecstatic ritual. Recall how the Sibyl was described by Hesiod with frenzied mouth, and by Homer, who said, "The prophetess storms wildly in the cavern so she may shake the mighty god from her breast." And if this weren't enough, there's evidence too of the use of psychoactive drugs as the catalyst for the Sibyls, as much, if not more, than with ancient shaman. As an example, archaeologists studying the temple of the Oracle at Delphi, remember that's supposed to have been the first Sibyl, discovered that there's fissures in the cavern, right, where the priestess prophesies. And those fissures are releasing gases from deep, deep underground that are filling this chamber in the cavern. And if you inhale those gases, it could easily induce altered states of consciousness, even visions. So whether we're talking about soma or the kykeon or whatever it is, or breathing the fumes from the earth, We have psychoactive substances at the root of these visionary experiences. Same is the case for the shaman. All right, now with that out of the way, let's move to the prophecies of the coming of Christ. I am as struck by them as any of you, I'm sure. But I also want to recognize the objections that many will raise. For instance, we know that the Sibyl was originally associated with the great mother goddess. She is among the most ancient and universal expressions of deity and is tied closely to the power of nature and of the earth to create. She is the goddess of fertility and birth and life. That said, the many references to the virgin who gives birth to the god or demigod is in some sense par for the course. It's not a uniquely Christian concept, and so may be a genuine prediction of the coming of Christ or just another reference to the goddess who gives birth to the gods and men. As for the virgin birth motif, the Greeks knew of many figures with this pedigree before the time of Christ. Perseus, Osiris, Dionysus, and Adonis, to name a few. To complicate matters further, many of those figures had mystery cults surrounding their myths and rituals. These so-called mysteries involved altered states of consciousness, personal communion with the divine, and the conquering of death. Just like, wait for it, Christianity. I guess I'd like to end by pointing to a thread that passes through all of this. Remember that Euripides said the Sibyl was half mortal and half divine, and that she channels Apollo to become the bridge uniting God and man. Add to this the prophecy that divinity will be joined to humanity, and you begin to see my point. Everything about the Sibyl is a preformation of the mystical message that will one day conquer the world in Christianity. That God and man are one.
Well, there